Let's start thinking about some of the different ways that we call methods and how they get the data that they use to perform the task that that method is programmed to do. So here are two different method calls, one that does math.squareRoot on a number and another that does string.characterAt for a given index. So I want you to think about as many things as you notice or as you know about what's different between these two different types of method calls that are shown here. There are actually two different types. See at least if you can see anything different about the two specific method calls, and then let's work from there to think about the types of method calls that we're dealing with here. And in particular, if you think about what data is being used by each, that will help you to categorize these two and to notice the types. So pause for a moment and think about what's different between the two method calls, and in particular, what data is being used by each of those method calls. So surface level and the deep, take a moment and pause. Okay. So on the surface level, the first thing that I notice between the two of these is that this one starts with a capital letter and the other one starts with a lowercase letter. And then let's start to think about why. It's an uppercase letter, a capital letter, because this square root method is called with the class name. So this is called using the class name of math. Math is a class that means, just like when you write a something.java file and you define a class in it. So far we haven't done too much with those classes themselves, but we know that we define classes, I hope. And on the other hand, this starts with a lowercase letter, the string.characterAt, str.characterAt, because it's referring to a variable. It's referring to a specific string, so called using a variable named str, meaning that it will also use the data inside of str, right? If I ask for characterAt, I need to know what index, but I also need to know what string am I even getting a character from? So it uses data from str and the parameters. Whereas the square root uses data only from the parameter of 6 here. So these are other differences between these two things being shown here, these two different method calls. And they belong to different categories of method call, because one of them is called a static method call and the other is a non-static method call. There are other ways to name these, but we're going to call them that for these purposes here, just to have a clear differentiation between a static method call and a non-static method call. Your standard system out print line is a static method call because it's using the system class to tell it to print out some stuff. And your scanner.nextLine is non-static because it needs a specific scanner variable to be able to be called. And so this will start us down a path of thinking about classes versus objects. So as I mentioned before, a class is the specification of the code. The class defines what is possible, the data types, which are called fields or instance variables, and the methods. So a class defines sort of a specification, a general thing. The string class defines that strings have individual characters, that they have methods like characterAt and things like that. It says what can a string be and what can a string do. It's like the description of what it means to be a person. What can people do? And then on the other hand, objects are actual instances of a given class. So when we are talking about a class like the string class, then that means that an object version, an instance of the string class, like the word the in quotes in Java, is going to be an actual object that will get stored in memory. It will have access to those methods that were defined in the class. So its behavior and its limitations, its behavior, its data, its limitations and possibilities are defined by its class type. So every object has a type. That type was defined as a class. If we have a point object, that means that there must have at some point been a point class that was probably defined in a file named point.java, and it tells us that points have x and y and that they can do different things. But then we create an actual point, that is the point 3, 5 or something like that. So as we go forward further in our thinking, we're going to want to think about the definitions of things like classes and the actual instantiations of those things, the real versions of those that get used. For our purposes here, we can define a static method without any objects needed. And you've done this for probably a lot of your methods if you took CS 415. And you just define the methods to exist sort of on their own. They get parameters and they don't deal with much that sort of existed before and hold on to things after. Whereas objects will hold on to data. That string that you defined holds on to its characters, and that scanner holds on to the data that it's scanning over. And it uses those methods to do things with that. So we'll look today at these two different types of methods, static methods that don't require any object before them. They require a class definition. And then non-static methods that belong to a class, yes, but they will also need an object to do some information with so that they get the data of the object they were called with, and they get possibly some parameters that were defined. It's got two sources of data compared to the one for something that's static. So keep those concepts in mind of static and non-static, class versus object, as you move forward to do parts B and C of the objects activity.